I wanted to highlight what I'd seen in Syria, but mainly what the corporate media doesn't report about. And in fact, I wanted to highlight both the hypocrisy and double standards of the corporate media. The way corporate media has reported on Syria is to choose only a small segment of society that supports the NATO narrative and ignore the vast population living in government-secured areas because their voices don't align with the NATO narrative. So at first, I'd like to begin, by addressing the myth that is until now put forth that from the very beginning, the protests in Syria were peaceful. And I think it's an important point to raise because it shows that from the beginning, this was an orchestrated war on Syria. It's not something that just went awry. It was premeditated. Right, it's in my eyes. So I'll begin by showing two clips. This is Lily and Stephen Sayuni, and I met them in April 2014 on my first trip to Syria. And these are brief clips, but I'll begin with Stephen, who speaks about what they saw in their city, Latakia, on the coast, the western coast of Syria.
Like when you're saying it's they say call themselves peaceful. You do not go burn places, you do not burn shops, you do not burn people's cars. They went even, I'm saying in Sheikh Dahir Square.
In Latakia?
Sheikh Dahir is downtown.
Downtown Latakia. They went into a communication where you pay the bill for your cell phone and they burnt it down to the ground.
So there was violence right at the beginning.
Violence. Yes. And the Syrian security forces had orders from the Syrian president that to not use a gun. They had only sticks in their hand only. And tens of Syrian police, Syrian security forces were knifed, stabbed, and beaten either by knives or rocks or sticks. And some of them have died.
Okay.
Martyred was the last word he said.
April the 1st of 2011 was the first day that I read a report online in the Los Angeles Times detailing a so-called peaceful protest in Latakia which had turned violent. And I responded to the author of that article, found her on Facebook, and I discussed this with her because all of her details were wrong. She had lied throughout the whole report because I live here and that day was a Friday and I had been all over the town on various chores. So I had been in every spot shopping or visiting or doing something that she had reported on, and none of those details in her report were true. She admitted that she lived in Beirut, had never been to Latakia, and had heard these rumors. They had been told to her by others. The others, I must assume, they were opposition activists that knew where she lived in Beirut and knew she was a journalist for the Los Angeles Times, and they fed her this false information. So she published it. She then told me to contact her editor by email and that she would love to have an private interview with me to get the true details. I wrote to her editor 5 times, never replied, and then I replied back to her.
Again, never replied, so I don't know why that cut off. Now, before I ever went to Syria, as Carrie mentioned, I was living in Gaza, and I left Gaza in March 2013 and went back to Canada, where I live. And I started talking with Syrians living in Canada about their perspective on what was happening in their country. And countless Syrians told me that they would see something primarily on Al Jazeera, and they would call their loved ones in whatever city or town they were in, and hear, no, that's not happening. And I'll just give you a very brief other anecdote. Recently, I interviewed a doctor based in the States, Dr. Hussam Salman, and he told me a story, also it was around mid-2011, where he's a doctor. He was living in Saudi Arabia at the time. He was in surgery. His wife and children were in Syria, and they had gone to an area near Madaya, to the west of Damascus. And he was in surgery. He didn't know, but his wife texted him, oh my God, we're going to die. And then sometime after, alhamdulillah, we made it. So basically what happened was that they had been going from an area near Madaya towards Madaya and back to Damascus, and suddenly a soldier jumped out from an armored vehicle and started waving his hands frantically, and they rolled down their windows, and he said, get back, there's firing. So basically the soldier was being fired upon by armed people in Madaya Hills, and he risked his life jumping from behind the vehicle to warn the civilians to turn away. So they did, and as they were driving back to Damascus, they got a call from a relative who said, don't go to Madaya, the regime is firing on civilians, because that's what was being broadcast, presumably Al Jazeera, one of these channels. But I'd like to move on and quote a man, the late Father Frans van der Loot. He was, I believe, Dutch. He lived in Syria for decades, and he was based in Homs. And in early 2012, he wrote, most of the citizens in Syria do not support the opposition. Even a country like Qatar has stated this following an opinion survey. Therefore, you can't say this is a popular uprising. The majority of people are not part of the rebellion and certainly not part of the armed rebellion. And I'll just skip forward. From the start, the protest movements were not purely peaceful. From the start, I saw armed demonstrators marching along in the protest who began to shoot at police first. Very often, the violence of security forces was a reaction to the brutal violence of the armed rebels. Now, Father Frans was killed in April 2014. He was assassinated by one of the so-called moderate rebels in Homs. And I went to Homs in June 2014, and I was able to speak with a close friend of his, Nazim Kanawati. And he said that Father Frans was shot point-blank assassinated in the back of his head. But he said that Father Frans had been a peacemaker. He hadn't chosen sides. He was simply reporting what he was seeing. Another man, Abu Nabil, who I met in Homs, told me that the militants or the terrorists who killed Father Frans, they had actually demanded that he hand over valuables that residents of the old city of Homs had entrusted to him when they left for their own safety, and he refused to do so. So in his opinion, that was one reason why Father Frans was assassinated. And that this is the point where he was assassinated. Now, I'd like to just briefly play a clip. All these clips, by the way, are on my YouTube. I've cut them very short for the sake of time here. But I'd like to play a clip from Dara. I went to Dara in May 2018, before Dara was liberated of the terrorists occupying Dar al-Balad and other parts of the greater area of Dara city. And it's notable that Dara is the place where we're told the so-called revolution began in Syria. So when I went there, I was really interested to talk with people about what life was like in those early days. So the following is a very brief clip from a longer interview I did with a priest in Dara.
منذ البداية كانت صرخة المتظاهرين المسيحي إلى بيروت والعلوي على التابوت. كان يأتي المتظاهرون من القرى ومن درعا البلد ليجتمعوا داخل درعا المدينة. لم يكن هناك جيش في المدينة أساسا. هناك مفارس شرطية موجودة، وهذا موجود في كل العالم وليس فقط في سوريا أو في درعا تحديدا. لم يكن هناك إطلاق نار من الجيش. كنا نرى كان يأتي بعض المتظاهرين الذين يركبون الدراجات النارية وهم يحملون الأسلحة ويطلقون من الحي باتجاه المجمع الحكومي.
To the government areas was the last bit he said. Now, the next clip, also a brief clip from a longer interview I'd like to play, is with Dr. Amr Ghantus, who is in the audience with us today. And he was based in a military hospital in Dara province, Dara governorate. And so he talked at length about the lies of corporate media regarding what was really happening at the hospital where he was based. And he specifically said that the staff at that hospital, it was a military hospital, had orders to treat any civilians that came there first, before soldiers. So again, I've cut this clip down, but it's very important what Dr. Amr had to say.
It was very clear in the instruction at the hospital, the civilians would have the priority. Some civilians, injured civilians, came from the town, and other soldiers, they were injured and maybe killed, they came from other areas. Mm-hmm. In this district, the civilians, they had the priority to go into the operation room to get the medical service, and the soldiers were waiting. We were like maybe 30 specialized doctors in this hospital. Mm-hmm. It was Al Jazeera breaking news from the very same hospital we were at. And I was okay. So it was the first piece of news on breaking news. Al Sanamin Hospital, it doesn't admit any civilian injuries.
Wow.
And it was repeated, their way to repeat the news every single minute. It was on this, like, breaking news. And it was repeated and repeated. We were, what? We were there, and everyone was getting the proper medical service. And after, like, a few minutes, the second piece of news was that there are no medical staff in the military hospital. There are, like, more than enough doctors and nurses and employees, way more than enough. It was under control from a medical point of view. I remember I saw in the hall, in the emergency room hall, I saw some people, some women taking videos with their mobile phones. I believe they were broadcasting because on the TV it was like a mobile phone video recording. And we saw the injury in the emergency room, and it was on Al Jazeera breaking news. It was broadcast direct, live from the same hospital, and we didn't know how. I believe there was and because in that time there was not so much advanced technology in this, so I believe some people, they were already equipped with high-tech things to make a good live broadcast from the very same place in this.
So now he was talking about March, either mid to late March or early April 2011. And that's a very important point, that last bit, about them already being equipped with the technology to be streaming. Because I myself, when I'm in Syria, I have a Samsung 7 smartphone, and I get the best Syrian internet data bundle I can get. And it's still, I can upload photos and videos, but in some areas of Syria, I can't get reception, period, especially in areas, rural areas. So I wonder what the woman he's mentioning, what kind of technology she had. I think my colleagues Vanessa and Patrick could attest to how difficult it is in some areas of Syria. So an average Syrian in a hospital, why would they have a satellite phone or whatever the technology it is, unless this was perhaps premeditated, that they be there to upload footage to imply something that Al Jazeera would then air. I'd just also like to note that, I'll say it briefly, I interviewed a soldier who was sent to Dara in March 2011, and amongst the many things he said, including being only armed with a stick or a baton and being fired upon by protesters, he and the other soldiers he was with and the police they were with basically being massacred and begging their commanders to give them weapons to defend themselves. And for 3 weeks, according to his testimony, they weren't given weapons. But another thing he said was that some months later, he saw footage on Al Jazeera claiming to be present, so in May or June, and he said that footage was from March 2011. So Al Jazeera was airing it later, claiming this was Dara at the time. Now, I'll skip on to the issue of starvation in Syria, because I'm sure you're all aware that the Syrian government is accused of starving its people. And I'm so grateful to Patrick for his presentation, particularly noting the deception of media and the figures behind it. The Guardian has been one of the worst war propagandists on Syria. And additionally, they've attacked those people who dare to go to Syria and report honestly. But one thing I'd like you to note is that the location of the reporters. So one of their star reporters, Karim Shaheen, is usually in Istanbul. This time he happened to be in Dubai. But he's not in Syria. And they're also relying on aid organizations or on activists for their information on Madaya in this area in question. So in 2016, Madaya was a buzzword. Madaya is hungry, Madaya is starving. People were very concerned about Madaya. Murad Gazdiyev of Russia Today went to Madaya during one of the aid deliveries, and he interviewed people who said, no, there's food here, but we don't access it. The terrorists are hoarding the food. But nonetheless, the theme was pushed, not only Madaya, but also Aleppo. Here we have both, I believe this one was both Madaya and Aleppo, or perhaps that last one. And in 2016, Vanessa Beeley, my colleague, was in Aleppo as it was being liberated of Al-Qaeda, Al-Zinki, and other terrorist factions. And amongst her YouTube testimonies, which are on her YouTube channel, she has many with people saying that they were starving us and all the other abuses they were subject to. Even Reuters deigned to admit that rebels had a storage of food. And this was the common theme in all the areas that the corporate media said the Assad regime, quote unquote, is starving harming the people, in all those areas, it turned out that the terrorists within took all the food aid that was sent in by the Syrian government and by aid agencies. In 2015, December 2015, I went to an area of Homs called Al-War. It was still occupied by militants, by terrorists. And this is at a government checkpoint, a Syrian army checkpoint. And medicine and food was being sent into Al-War. And there was a bread factory where the wheat was supplied by the government and the bread was being sent into Al-War. And this is the last Syrian army checkpoint, and roughly 100 meters down was the militant or the terrorist checkpoint. So civilians could actually go to and from. In June 2017, after Al-War was cleared through a reconciliation process allowing Syrians, not foreign terrorists, Syrians who wanted to lay down their weapons and take reconciliation and return to their civilian lives to do so, and others to be bused to areas of Syria like Idlib or Jarablus. So after that happened, then civilians were able to come back to Al-War. And I went there and I talked with a number of civilians. You can find all that on my website, my blog. But essentially, it was the same story, that there was food there. The terrorists had control of the food, and if civilians wanted to get any, they had to pay a tremendous price. The prices were highly inflated. Now, back to Homs 2014. This is Ayman al-Akhras and his sister Zainat al-Akhras. And they stayed in the old city of Homs, despite the presence of terrorist factions, who again, the Western corporate media were calling moderates at the time. And what they had to say to me was, they didn't leave because they wanted to protect their home. And they said, Zainat, the woman, she lost 34 kilos because essentially the terrorists came and stole every last morsel of food that they had. She said, I'm sorry, I don't know. She said 38 times they came to steal our food. The first couple of times they knocked on the door, and after that they entered with guns. The last thing they took were our dried peas, our cracked wheat, our olives, and finally our za'atar, which is a wild thyme mix. We started to eat grass and whatever greens we could find in February 2014. That's all we had till Homs was liberated. And if I recall, Homs was liberated, I think it was May 2014. So it's ironic that the corporate media, they would say these things about areas where the terrorists were controlling food, but they would never speak about the areas where the terrorists were besieging or thieving from civilians. So that's one issue. I mean, I have countless more examples, but I kind of want to give an overview. That's one issue that we've heard time and time again, and I guarantee we'll be hearing it about Idlib when the operation to liberate Idlib starts. Now, chemical weapons has been an issue that's been reiterated over the years, always at times when it's supremely inconvenient for the Syrian army to have used a chemical gas or weapon on the people, when they've been winning by standard military tactics, and when, by all rights, they know that it will bring on the wrath of the Western world. It's highly illogical that they would use chemical weapons. But in any case, back to The Guardian. This is The Guardian. Karim, again in Istanbul, pushing the lie, frankly, that in Duma, a chemical gas or even a nerve agent was used. They said symptoms which included frothing at the mouth, suffocation, dilated and constricted pupils, blah, 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 blah. These are all symptoms of sarin gas, is what The Guardian was claiming. And yet, as we all, I'm sure you're aware, France, the UK, the US bombed Syria illegally before OPCW chemical weapons inspectors could actually do their job. And this was later used, again, this is The Guardian, to call for military intervention in Syria, this chemical weapons lie. Now, if they had bothered to send a journalist to Duma, they would have heard, like Vanessa Beeley heard, like Pearson Sharp of One American News heard, like Robert Fisk of The Independent heard, that medical staff in Duma at the hospital point did not believe, they said flatly, no chemical attack had occurred. There were no symptoms of a chemical attack. Now, I spoke with civilians in Duma, and here they talk not only, I'm going to have to translate because I didn't have time to subtitle this, I'm sorry, but essentially they're talking about life under Jaish al-Islam and also the fact that they didn't believe a chemical attack occurred. So I'll just play this and I'll translate bits while it plays.
Did they have like this?
كان في عندكم خضرة وفواكه ولا؟
No.
يعني كانوا لا حليب.
We didn't have milk for children. We didn't have bread.
يعني الحمد لله.
Did Jaish al-Islam have food?
I asked if Jaish al-Islam had these things.
جيش الإسلام أكل وشرب كان
Camel, they had it, plenty of it.
آخر المستودعات اللي وجدناها بتكفي دوما 5 سنين.
He was basically saying there was enough food in Duma to last 5 years. That might be an exaggeration, but the point is there was ample amounts of food.
Did you ever see Jaish al-Islam execute civilians?
I'm asking if they saw executions.
شفتوا بأحد المرات المجموعة الإرهابية جيش الإسلام عم يقتلوا العالم ويعدموهم بالشارع؟
Yes. This guy's talking about a time when children saw an execution and they were so traumatized by it they couldn't speak for a few months. He's talking about how they put a gun in somebody's mouth and blew his head off. They are the meaning of the word terrorists.
Do they think that there was a chemical attack here?
What?
Do they think there was a chemical attack here?
انتوا كنتوا بتفكروا انه في هجوم كيماوي المزعوم هذا اللي حكوا
لا
عنه؟
لا ما في هجوم نوب لا كيما ولا شيء هن عم يستدعوا انه عم يضلوا العالم مشان يخوفوا تخويف.
So he's basically saying, no, there wasn't an attack. They told us that to scare us from the Syrian government.
خافوا ونحن يعني العالم الناس كلها تخاف من النظام. هي كله هدي.
In any case, the point is, when I went around talking to people in Duma, I'd ask them usually first whether there's a chemical attack, and they would say no, and they'd say, but we want to tell you how life was here. And then they'd talk about Jaish al-Islam literally executing people in the streets, cutting their heads off or point-blank assassinating them and starving them. And now this is the hospital room in question. If you've seen the videos claiming there was a chemical attack in Duma and that people were being hosed down, this is the room in question. And this was a medical student who works at that hospital. So he talks about the fact that there were no symptoms, contrary to what the Guardian claimed from Istanbul, that there were no symptoms of any chemical attack amongst the patients that they were treating.
الأعراض ما هي أعراض يعني إصابة بالدماغ، يعني أعراض لا في حلقات تبوسية، لا في مثلا تشنجات عصبية أدت للموت أو شيء، حتى ما في ولا وفية يعني السلاح كانوا بده يخوفوا فيها. الأعراض اللي اجتنا هي كلها أعراض اختناق، يعني مرضى عندهم كان شيء ربويين، مرضى متأثرين بالدخنة كثير، اجوا لهون تم علاجهم علاج عرضي، أعطيناهم يعني موسعات قصبية، إرزاز، سالبوتامول، وبعدين تم التعامل معهم بشكل يعني طبي وخرجناهم البيت، بس هون لمنازلهم. بس كان في اشخاص غريبين ما بنعرفهم صاروا فتحوا الصندوق، هن الغريبين وقت اجوا الاشخاص الغرباء اللي ما حدا يعرفهم هن، وهن ما ذوي كفاءة طبية، يعني ما لا معهم حتى سادس ولا تاسع ولا معهم شهادات علمية، اجوا بس هيك زتوا اشاعة ما بنعرفهم. وصارت في بعض الاشخاص مثل يعني صار تفاعلوا بهالموضوع، خافوا فصاروا يشغلوا مي يرشوا شوي، اطباء هون قاعدة تهدي العالم، حتى في اطباء سكرت يعني الغربيش المي سكرت المي، حتى يعني فات احد الاطباء لا اذكر مين انه قال لهم هي كلها حالات اختناق عرضيه مثل ما بتجينا بالعاده، يعني عاملناها طبيعي وخرجوا لبيوتهم لمنازلهم. يعني لو حسن دياب اللي عم تحكي عليه لو في كيماوي كان ما لازم يكون عايش.
Okay, Hassan Diab, by the way, was a child amongst 17 people that were taken to The Hague to present their testimonies about what happened in Duma. And basically, corporate media said, we don't find their testimonies credible, even though this is the same corporate media that found the testimony or the tweets of Bana al-Abid, a 6 or 7-year-old girl who was in East Aleppo. They found her tweets credible, but they didn't find 17 people, including medical staff, their testimonies credible. Now, Robert Fisk, who is a fairly well-respected reporter, he doesn't hide his loathing for the Syrian government. However, in spite of the fact that he doesn't like the Syrian government, he went to Duma and he reported honestly. And he said as well, from what he heard from people who he interacted with walking freely around Duma, and also from medical staff, again, there were no symptoms of a chemical attack having occurred. And even the OPCW, who haven't issued a final report yet to my knowledge, but in their interim report, they specifically said that there were no organophosphorus nerve agents detected in the samples they took from the areas in question. So I'll skip on to this photo. I'm sure you're aware of this boy, Amran Daknish. He was called the face of human suffering in Syria. He was also called the poster child of the revolution in Syria. And the story was that in August 2016, he was injured or gravely injured by a Syrian or Russian airstrike on his home. And indeed, his face was plastered all over Western media. And CNN was so traumatized that she broke down while reading her script and started crying for Amran. And Christiane Amanpour basically passed the photo of Amran to Sergei Lavrov, and basically said, this is a war crime, what do you have to say? Accusing him, essentially, accusing Russia of being guilty. In reality, Amran Dakhnish wasn't injured by a Syrian or Russian airstrike. In fact, the family and neighbors told myself when I met him in June 2017, and then Vanessa, who went there also, that the militants had been striking that area because it was known that there were supporters of the government in that area. So he was mildly injured, but he wasn't gravely injured. I'll just let you hear a little bit of what Mr. Dakhnish has to say. There was a strike. I don't know what the nature of the strike was. I didn't hear any sound of an airplane or a blast.
يعني في كثير حالات نحن بنشوفها على التلفزيون بنبكي عليها بس مو حالات هيك بسيطة حالة بسيطة يعني الحمد لله يعني ما في أن نضخموا الأمر شظايا في الرأس وشعر بالجمجمة وبعدين هو ما في شيء الحمد لله.
So the reason he mentioned that it's nothing to cry about is that this guy, Mahmoud Raslan, he was the one that took the photo, and he got an award for it, the photo of Amran sitting in the ambulance that went viral. But he's also buddies, so you can see in the bottom right-hand corner, with not just with Nuruddin al-Zinki terrorist in general, but the Nuruddin al-Zinki terrorist who beheaded Abdullah Issa, who was a Palestinian teen. And he was beheaded, I believe it was a month before Amran's light injury. If anybody's the poster child of suffering, this boy, Abdullah Issa, who is literally begging to be shot instead of being killed, he's certainly a candidate for that title. But anyway, Mahmoud Raslan, in the interviews he got after becoming famous for taking this photo, he said to The Independent or one of the British papers that he cried for children like Amran. The nerve of this man to say it when he's in this photo, bottom right-hand corner, taking a selfie with the murderers of Abdullah Issa. And yet he was somebody that the corporate media found credible. I have a lot more to say about Amran Dakhnish. However, for the sake of time, I would ask that you maybe search for Vanessa's article on it, for my article and other people's article. But basically, the father felt his son, and he's correct, he felt his son had been exploited, not only by the terrorists, but by the corporate media. And I fully agree. To this day, I'm not aware of any Western corporate media who's bothered to go to Aleppo, where the family lives in safety and at peace now, to interview Amran. Instead, I've seen that some people still exploit this boy. It's truly shameful. I will skip ahead now to Dara. So I mentioned that I was there in May 2018. In addition to asking people about what they saw in the early days of the protest, I also went to the state hospital. And basically, it was difficult to get there. I'm going to have to skip past this one. Oh, no, okay, I'm sorry, that's okay. It was difficult to get there because basically you had to go along a road where snipers were roughly 100 meters off. But a third or half of the hospital was either destroyed or badly damaged or not usable because of the presence of terrorists literally 100 meters away. Now, corporate media cared so much for hospitals, whether or not they were actually struck, like the Al-Quds Hospital in Aleppo, but they didn't care at all about this hospital in the birthplace of the revolution that citizens had a hard time accessing because the terrorist snipers were off the road, that they needed to get to the hospital. This clip starts first with a school that's been badly damaged. You can hear the translation.
The terrorist groups, they target this schools more 50 mortars. 50. 50 years.
Yes.
There are snipers.
Yes, I heard.
هاي المناطق الإرهابية مقابلنا هنيك هون آخر نقطة.
We should move quickly because
Yes.
terrorist groups they can sniping.
Yes.
ندخل فورا في قنص هلا.
There's still medicines inside the pharmacy, and they can't bring the medicines because the road is sniping by the terrorist group. They can't bring or take anything from.
حماية من الرصاص هاي.
We make that just to protect.
Yes.
We should go quick.
مقابل الارهابيين فورا.
We are next to the terrorist groups. Yes.
Where are they?
اي حركه
هنا
بيستهدفوها. بعيدين اقل من 100 متر من هون.
They are less than 100 meters.
In that
from the-
direction?
Yes, in that directions.
What was this area of the hospital?
It's all hospital of gynecology and
Okay.
obstetrics.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
What area was it? شو كان نسوي هناك?
هي the school of nursing.
This is the children's
But they can't reach it because of sniping or shelling?
وهذا ما فينا انه يعني لانه في ارهابيين هون.
أقل من 150 متر.
Under
Less
150
150
سوق شعبي.
next to us Sabir neighborhood and there's bakery.
بكون
Are there
نزلت
pe-
على شي سياره او على
Are there
شي
still
كذا.
people living there?
ولسه العالم ما زالت
تعودت
موجودة وعايشة.
العالم تعودت ما فيها تسافر ما بدها تروح على اوروبا العالم. نحن
The people
بدنا
they
نبقى.
didn't
So they are still in that neighborhood?
they didn't think to leave.
Okay, so there was a lot more to that clip. However, basically, I just wanted to highlight that there was a hospital being attacked routinely that the corporate media didn't give a damn about. Now, I'll have to skip quickly through this, but this is a boy. His name is Laith Al-Hajj. He was 6 years old. He's from an area called Fua. There's two villages next to each other, Fua and Kafraya. They're in Idlib. So, you know, Idlib is the focus of corporate media, but again, they never talk about these villages. They had been besieged since March 2015, meaning they were desperate for food, they were desperate for medicine, medical care, electricity, heating in the winter, etc. And on top of that, they were being routinely bombarded by terrorists surrounding them, and they were also being sniped. This boy was sniped. Thankfully, he did survive. He was in critical condition, and he didn't have access to a proper hospital because of the siege of the terrorist groups. His younger brother, a 4-year-old younger brother, I think his name was Muhammad, was also sniped in the neck, but also did survive. This is a boy, it's not my photo, but it's an image of a child from Fua in Kafraya. So talk about starvation, but again, these people don't matter. When the corporate media deigned to mention them, they would call it the Shia villages. And this has been a tactic of theirs, is to relegate areas by sectarian words as though they're not important. This is another area. This is in Homs. It's called Al Zahra, and this was subjected to numerous car and suicide bombings. And this was in December 2015. I went there a couple days after a car and suicide bombing, and the human suffering there was immense. And so I did write a long article about the hypocrisy of corporate media in not covering these kind of issues. However, again, for the sake of time, I'll have to skip ahead. But yeah. Okay, all right. Well, then I'll dwell a little bit on this suffering. Basically, so the corporate media, when they did address Zahra, they would call it an Alawite area, or a government-held area. But as I wrote, in reality, it's a district comprising a majority of Alawites, but also significant numbers of Christians, Sunnis, and Shias, many of whom are internally displaced people that went there for safety, seeking shelter. And they came from other provinces, even Aleppo and Idlib. And so by depicting Zahra simply as an Alawite area, their sectarian project. And sectarianism is something most Syrians I've encountered in now 11 trips to Syria since 2014. They reject it. If you talk to Syrians, they'll talk about celebrating one another's festivals with each other. And Vanessa was in Aleppo this past year over Christmas. And Aleppo is predominantly Sunni. And they had massive Christmas displays, a massive Christmas tree. So this sectarianism is solely from the outside. There might be a small number of these fundamentalists, but normal Syrians of all faiths reject it. But it's been a project of the corporate media, including in reporting on places like Zahra, to insert these sectarian ideas, just like the media does with Palestine, saying, oh, well, it's an age-old conflict. No, it's not. It's a colonial project that has genocided Palestinians. But back to this, I'll just skip ahead onto highlighting other areas or other issues of suffering that corporate media won't touch. So for years and years, terrorists in Eastern Ghouta, the Eastern Ghouta that Western media was crying over, were mortaring Damascus and Damascus outskirts areas and maiming and killing children like these. So these are children I met in the Damascus University Hospital. The child on the top photo was in critical condition. She was 3 years old. And there were many other children with different degrees of maimings. And I'll just give you one anecdote. In April 2014, terrorists shelled the Manar School in Old Damascus. 60 kids were injured. 1 kid was killed. I was with the peace delegation at that time, and actually Andrew Ashdown is in the audience, and he was also on that delegation, and many of us went to the French hospital and were taking photos and videos and trying to share the reality of what these civilians were enduring. Lise Doucet, a Canadian reporter with the BBC, was there, and she was challenged on whether or not she would tell the truth. And her later article said, "The government is also accused of launching them into areas under its control." So she was negating essentially the fact that Syrians in Damascus were living a daily hell of mortar terrorism. Instead saying, no, it's believed, the locals believe that the government's doing it to blame the rebels. It's disingenuous and dishonest journalism. And anybody that's spent even a little bit of time in Damascus knows how intense those mortars were. And now that Ghouta has been liberated, Damascus civilians can walk in the street late at night without fear. And kids can go to school, and parents don't have to worry about their kids being wiped off the earth by these terrorist bombings. I'll fast forward to another area. Now, this area is important. Sorry. This is Mahardeh in Hama province, and Mahardeh is being attacked, was being attacked routinely by terrorists in the outskirts, only kilometers away. On September 7th, it's a Christian town, by the way. On September 7th, it was attacked with 9 Grad missiles, and 6 of those had prohibited cluster submunitions, and they were attacked by these Al-Qaeda-affiliated terrorists, and as of the 19th of September, 13 civilians had died as a result, including children. And so this is Shadi Shehadeh, and he lost his, I shouldn't say he lost, his wife and his 3 young children were murdered, and his mother were murdered by this terrorist missile attack. So he was clearly still in grief when I spoke with him. And he took me to his children's bedroom, and he showed me their belongings. He said they just had a bath when they just had their bath when they were killed. And I'll just play a little bit. This clip is on my YouTube, the longer version, just so you can get a sense of this man's horrible grief that he's enduring. And by the way, these terrorists would send them video messages saying that they planned on sending more, very sadistic messages, psychologically terrorizing the civilians in this town.
وقت استشهدوا من طالعين الحمام هذا السوسي السنين الصغيري هذا الافادي هاي ماريا هاي رسومات ماريا هاي رسومات فادي هاو هو يلعب بالحرب هذول اغراض الحرب هاي برد هاي شنتايد فادي هاي شنتايد السينما هاي العكس هاي شنتايد ماريا كانت هي مؤمنة دائما تروح على الكنيسة. قبل بيومين كان عيد ميلاده لعمر 6 سنين. هاي صورة عيد ميلاده. هاي هو هذا هو الولد. هاي صورة عيد ميلاد. هاي العيلة كلها. كل سنة احنا بنوجه بس انه رسالة انه الشعب ينظر معنا يعني يشوف ان حالتنا انه احنا عم نتعذب كثير اهل محري. محري عم نتعذب لدرجة ما توصف. هذا ابني وبنتي 3. هذا 1 2 3 ديلي وهذا خيي. دول 3 ديلي. كلتهم خيي.
So it was very hard to put my camera in this man's face, but I, at the same time, think it's very important that people outside of Syria understand there are so many families like his all over Syria that are suffering the loss of their loved ones due to the attacks of these terrorists that the West continues to insist are moderates. So I was just in Syria. I was there over New Year's, and then I went back again. I've just come back a couple of days ago. And my interest in these visits was to show the positive developments, because there are many positive things happening in Syria now, particularly, as I mentioned, with the liberation of Ghouta and also Yarmouk, Hajar al-Aswad inside of Damascus. meaning a return of stability to life, meaning that civilians can open businesses and can again walk without fear of being murdered. I did go to Idlib province. I went to the Abu al-Duhur area. I was trying to go to the humanitarian crossing. It wasn't possible because of the proximity of al-Qaeda terrorists 3 kilometers away. But then I went on to Sinjar, a village about, I think, 12 kilometers on, and was able to talk with civilians there and take their testimonies. And as I've just come back, I didn't have time to process those videos. But essentially what they had to say is the same kind of things that my colleagues and I have heard in Aleppo, in Ghouta, and elsewhere, under the rule of al-Qaeda and their fellow terrorists. However, on the note of positive things, I'll just play this video as I talk. This is in Aleppo. Now, Aleppo, remember, was a city that fell. In December 2016, the corporate media said Aleppo fell. And if you go there, you find just normal scenes. This is in front of the historic citadel. And this was impossible. To be anywhere near that citadel meant risking a sniper's bullet when terrorists occupied Aleppo. And now there are normal scenes, Syrians of varying faiths walking together as they always have. And you'll find that this is, of course, a generalization, but Syrians are very hospitable, loving people, and they're very kind to strangers. You see in the way people interact with me, always saying hello. I would really encourage you to go to Syria if you ever have the opportunity. So, I'll have to fast forward from here, but I will be putting this on my YouTube account. And there are many other scenes from Aleppo where you can just see normal life. Again, this is something that you don't see in corporate media. And when I upload these things, I get so many comments. People are actually genuinely hungry to see what normal life is because they don't actually see it. They perhaps have this idea that everywhere is bombed and destroyed. So that's one of the reasons I went back this time. And now these are scenes from eastern Ghouta. And again, Ghouta was liberated around April, I think April, May 2018. And these are scenes of normal life in Ghouta. Notice the restaurants, the food shops open. This is a people that were starving under the rule of Jaish al-Islam, Falaq al-Rahman, al-Qaeda, and the other terrorist factions. And now it's normal life. It's not perfect. They still have to rebuild. But at least the terrorism has stopped, and at least they have access to food and medical care. Okay, so that's just like any Syrian village around Syria. So in Aleppo, I also went to the Leramoun industrial area, which is on the northwest side of the city. And this is the man in this clip is a Syrian independent MP, Faris Shahabi. He's also the head of the Chamber of Industry in Aleppo. And he told me about this factory, and what's notable about it is that it's 400 to 500 meters from al-Qaeda terrorists occupying the Aleppo countryside. And the factory owners opened this factory in an act of defiance, saying, well, you'll hear what Faris Shahabi has to say, but it's notable that when they opened it, they came under intense shelling, and they're still subject to sniping and shelling.
We had to fortify the windows, see? So the snipers of al-Qaeda cannot see us, cannot see the workers, cannot kill them. And there is this door here. Open the door. Be careful. Take a glimpse at where al-Qaeda is.
How far away?
See those buildings over there?
Yeah.
Let me show you. Those buildings over there, in front of you?
Yes.
This is where the snipers is. Many snipers of al-Qaeda.
400 meters?
Yeah, 400, 500 meters max. All this line over there. They're heavily fortified over there. This is the borderline of West Aleppo. This is Aleppo countryside, western side, stretching back to Idlib. All this area is controlled by the Nusra Front, which is al-Qaeda branch in Syria. Meaning these are Bin Laden boys. And this is a factory here. Show me one place in the world, Eva. One place in the world where you can have production in a similar situation like this. Factory being rehabilitated, put back to work under these circumstances. None. And this is why they put us on sanctions. This is why they consider us as enemies. You know, how can I be an enemy of freedom and democracy if I want my people to work, you know, to make money, and my country to have a production economy, and I don't yield and I don't surrender to Al-Qaeda gangs just that far, you know, that proximity.
It ended with him saying that far away, that proximity. So I will get that clip up on my YouTube as well. But he mentioned the sanctions, and that is an issue that is never really talked about. But the sanctions are devastating Syria's economy and every aspect of life. It affects their ability to get machinery used in medicines. It affects their ability to get basic goods. And of course, as I said, it's devastated their economy. And the Western leadership say sanctions are targeting the leadership, but just as with Iraq and elsewhere around the world, these sanctions are targeting the people. So now, some corporate media were in Syria, Channel 4 News, for example, BBC from time to time, and particularly in times when there was a vilification campaign, whether it was about Aleppo starving or hospitals being bombed or whatever. Over New Year's, when Vanessa Beeley and I were there, I was told there were no other foreign journalists, no other Western journalists in Syria. And it didn't surprise me, because if they were there, all they could really report on was the positive, the lack of terrorism, the joy and exuberance that you saw in the streets. In closing, I'd like to quote former British ambassador to Syria, Peter Ford, who said, "Western mainstream media have their narrative and they don't want to see it disturbed. Any evidence that goes against their preferred narrative, namely that, quote, Assad is a butcher massacring his people, anything that disturbs that narrative is simply ignored or mocked. But the truth is beginning to come out. All these crocodile tears being cried are disgraceful, trading on sentiment, when behind it is just cynical great power maneuvering." And as Patrick said in his presentation, the elite never acknowledge when they're wrong, and it's the same with the corporate media, and they're wrong many, many, many times. So I can't agree more with Peter Ford. Those in corporate media who've lied about Syria and, of course, Libya, not talked about Yemen, who've lied about Palestine, Iraq, etc., and Venezuela now, they have the blood of civilians on their hands. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eva, for a wonderful presentation. Very powerful.